Hi, I'm Christian Hillary, and this is my presentation over the Louisiana Purchase. So here's the introduction to the territory. It's just an overview of the things I'll talk about. It getting settled by France, and then given to Spain, then taken back from France, and then sold to the United States finally. And then I'll talk about some of the future states, which are right here in my picture. It turned out to be 15. Okay, so the French were the first to explore the territory in the 17th century, and they set up many settlements like their most famous, New Orleans. They owned most of the territory in the United States out of all the dominant European powers for a very long time. And during the French and Indian War, France offered Louisiana to Spain in order to bring Spain into the conflict to side with the French. Spain did not accept their offer to join the war against Britain. Spanish officials were unsure of how and what exactly was in this massive colony of Louisiana. And then when the Family Compact, which was a supposedly secret alliance between France and Spain, became known to the British, they attacked Spain. And then in November 1762, in the secret treaty of Fontainebleau, France handed over the Louisiana Territory and New Orleans to Spain in order to make up for getting them attacked by the British and to keep Spain from going to war with them because of that. And then the entire territory was a burden to Spain the whole time, and it gave them many issues like debt and even rebellions. Louisiana was granted more trade privileges than most of the Spanish colonies while they owned it, but they limited Louisiana's trade to only 9 ports in Spain, and the passage of any ship that didn't have a captain and crew that was two-thirds Spanish was prohibited, and trade with Great Britain and Mexico was also outlawed, and they couldn't import any French wine, which really upset the French people who lived there. And then they ended up rebelling, and in 1800, Louisiana was ceded by Spain to France in the Treaty of San Ildefonso. Okay, so why sell? The French leader Napoleon viewed the territory as a big part of his new colonial empire in North America, and now that France was back in charge of the territory, Napoleon was able to do what he wanted with it. This threatened the commercial and political interest of the Americans. As a result, the United States, which was beginning to assert itself and claiming the vast unknown lands beyond the Mississippi because of manifest destiny, was forced to negotiate for trade privileges with a major rival on the continent, which would be Napoleonic France. And the failure to stop the slave rebellion in modern-day Haiti, which was Saint-Domingue back then, or Domingue, I don't know, was one of the main factors in the French eventually selling the territory to the United States. They were in debt, and because of the revolution in Haiti, which was their largest money-making colony, because they did sugar there, and that was big back then, they were in need of money. So Napoleon's plans of becoming a dominant power in the New World falling apart, and the loss of Saint-Domingue, he thought it best to cut ties and make money off the United States. So the negotiations, it was actually very fast. The negotiations began between the two countries in April of 1803. President Jefferson sent James Monroe to Paris to aid Livingston in the New Orleans Purchase talks. The negotiations moved super fast, and the deal was made within the same month on April 30th, 1803. Then in December of 1803, France transferred the authority over the region to the United States. So it all happened very fast. So exploration. Lewis and Clark, he sent Lewis and Clark, of course. So they got sent right after the negotiations were done, or even before the negotiations were even finished, actually. And he appointed Meriwether Lewis as commander of the expedition, And Lewis asked his longtime friend William Clark to help command this expedition because he knew it wouldn't be easy. They had 45 men in total, and they started in St. Charles, Missouri, and traveled upstream of the Missouri River. They were looking for the Northwest Passage, and they averaged about 15 miles a day, and the trip was very difficult because of the heat and then swarms of mosquitoes. I'm sure they were awful back then. Um, so Lewis and Clark met a French-Canadian trapper, Toussaint Carborough, I don't know how to say his name, and hired him as an interpreter. His wife was named Sacagawea, and she was a Shoshone Indian. She was used as an interpreter just like her husband, and both of them were valuable members of the expedition. On April 7th, 1805, Lewis and Clark sent half some of the group back with all of the maps and samples taken as research, while the rest of them headed towards the Pacific Ocean. They reached the Pacific Ocean in November of 1806. They left the fort on they left to head back home in March 23rd of 1806, and they mapped out the entire expedition and discovered at least 120 animal species, and then 200 botanical samples. And they also they made peaceful relations with dozens of Native American tribes. Lewis and Clark were both paid double their original pay, and they were also given 1,600 acres of land. And then Clark, he was made governor of the Louisiana Territory. So not all of the effects of the Louisiana Purchase were good. There were many Native American tribes that this hurt, of course. Some of the land that the French sold was not theirs to sell. It was Native American land in the first place. And the Indian nations occupying the Missouri watershed had sovereignty over their land, and it was still sold anyway, which is pretty awful. And they had no say over it. The Louisiana Purchase made it possible for people to colonize the land, and that affected the Native Americans who lived there also. It started the Indian removal. Well, the Louisiana Purchase started the long and horrible thing called the Indian removal. And then the American government used the Louisiana Purchase as a reason to move Native Americans out of the way so they could continue to colonize and move out west. Now that they had all this land, they could just move them out of the way and make space for land they can colonize. And then the large influx of Americans into their territory also affect Native Americans in many other ways, like their food supply. They started to hunt the bison, which was a big staple food of the Native Americans. And they didn't just hunt them for food, they hunted them for sport and almost hunted them to extinction. That was because of us buying the Louisiana Territory. And there's a picture of a buffalo getting hunted. So in conclusion, the Louisiana Purchase was a massive event in the history of the United States, and it had many pros and cons. It brought in 827 square miles into the United States, more than doubling the size of the United States. It added part or all of 15 new states into the Union, some of those slave states and some free. It was a highlight of the Jefferson administration, and it also is what he was most famous for. It would cost about 4 cents per acre, which is insanely cheap. And it also led to the removal of thousands of Native Americans from their homes and also their deaths. It has just as many cons as positives, but it is mainly seen as a great achievement. But you cannot overlook the pain and suffering it caused for many people as well. And